Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Jesse here with the Boynton Public Library. Happy Wednesday to you. Happy July to you. I am excited to bring you another book talk, this time about a trilogy that's written in graphic novel form. Okay, sorry, it's telling me what end live. I think I'm going. Computer's telling me things. Okay. Hopefully you can see me all right and my feed is broadcasting to you clearly. Like I was saying, today I'm going to be discussing a trilogy which is written in graphic novel form. The main author is John Lewis, congressman from the state of Georgia. He grew up in Alabama. He was the son of sharecroppers, and from the time he was a youngster, his parents knew that he was a little different. For example, he would practice preaching, and him being a child, he had some brothers and sisters, I forget how many, but he didn't have a congregation to practice preaching in front of, so he preached to the family's chickens, which is a great idea. You know, if you don't have people, and he lived in rural Alabama, so he didn't have many neighbors, so there weren't a group of kids to come over and listen to him. So he did the next best thing, and he practiced preaching in front of chickens, which is just a great idea. And not only that, when his family, they were farmers, and sharecropping means that they rented their land from someone, and most likely they gave some of their crop that they raised to their landlord, to the person who owned the land, and which meant that they had a lot to do. There was, and so the kids did a lot on the farm for the family. So, in a twist that is not typical, John, as a child, would defy his father and sneak away to school. Now, we kind of hear it as when you're doing wrong when you're a child, you skip school. You leave school in order to go do something fun. And John really liked school and really loved to learn, and knew that the power of books and to be able to read and write were very, very important. So he would defy his father when he knew he was supposed to stay home and work with the family. He would actually sneak off, hop on the bus, go to school, learn, and come back home and have to face the consequences. Luckily, his father noticed something kind of special in his son, and would still tell John that he had to respect his father's wishes, but understood that it was really important for John to get a good education, and that in rural Alabama, when John was growing up in the 30s, that a good education could be a ticket as a way out onto bigger and better things, and not just be a sharecropper like his father. So there's a couple cool, interesting backgrounds for that. So yeah, he wrote 3 of these books. One with someone he works with in his office in Washington, D.C., and they found an illustrator, Nate Powell, to do all the illustratings for these 3 terrific books. And the first one focuses on John growing up, kind of his the principles that shaped his life. The second one starts with John starting to go to college, and he went to college in Tennessee, in Nashville, Tennessee, learning more about a bigger world around him, and him getting involved with the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent counseling committee and coordinating committee, and their objective was to get people to do nonviolent sit-ins, nonviolent protests, in order to try and change some of the segregation laws that were going on in all throughout the South. We talk about the American Civil War, one of the founding causes to be slavery. It was very divisive within our country, and the North fought the South for 5 long years, and after that war, we were one country, and the southern states had a lot of work to do. It was tough for them. They had suffered a lot through the war, not only with the death of lots and lots of their people, but the destruction of a lot of their land, and then they were forced to kind of swear an oath to this country to be let back in. So there was lots going on. And in 1870, the right to vote was granted to all men, regardless of the color of your skin. And fast forward 1950s, 1960s, almost 100 years later, they were still having trouble enforcing that. And registering to vote for a black man could be very, very difficult, or a black woman. Women were granted the right in 1919, I believe. Some of those great teen amendments that happened throughout our rich history. So he joined the SNCC and started doing nonviolent protests and sit-ins, and which resulted in him getting arrested many, many times. And this created a rift between him and his parents. His parents were of the opinion that if you got arrested, it brought shame to the family. But in John's mind, he was getting into what he called good trouble. He was fighting laws that he did not believe or that he thought were unjust. And so in order to do that, John took on the responsibility of getting arrested, being put in jail, and even when he was in jail, if he could pay $3 and get out, he would choose to stay in jail rather than pay that $3, because to pay the $3 and get out for being arrested for something he didn't believe in, he didn't think was right. So he would accept the penalty, not pay the unfair fee, and do his time. But then when he got out, he would just get back to what he called good trouble and getting involved in that. When he was young, he found a comic book that was about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and nonviolence and having better living, working, learning environments for African American people throughout the country. So it's cool that when John was a teenager, he found this comic book about one of his heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and all these years later, he's going to write a trilogy in graphic novel form, which is a lot like comic books, to inspire a whole new generation of people. And this trilogy really is inspiring. I mean, I was a history major in college and knew some about our nation's history and the fight for civil rights, but this book explains it this trilogy explains it in a really great way. You get to learn so much about John Lewis and his life, but then he introduces you to a lot of other people, good friends of his, who fought just as hard and fought alongside for the rights of so many people. And so it does a great job of explaining our history, but in this graphic novel form with the comics and the pictures and the action, it really does read really fast, but you're getting terrific information, great knowledge about our rich history as a country. I can just show you a few of the illustrations. They're all black and white, which is pretty cool because it was set mostly in the early 60s. The first one is John growing up in Alabama, and then he takes a trip with his uncle to New York City, and really to go into the North for John was a huge experience and allowed him to see that segregation doesn't exist throughout the country. Segregation exists in his home in Alabama, but it doesn't exist to the degree that it does in the North. And segregation is what the South adopted after the Civil War, separate but equal. So they would have a school for black people and a school for white people. They would have a movie theater, and sometimes that was for whites and for blacks, or there would be an entrance for white people and an entrance for black people, and they would be kind of separated into maybe the first floor was for white people and the second floor was for black people. So segregation really means they wanted to keep the people separate depending on the color of their skin. So there was a Supreme Court decision shortly before John joined the SNCC. It was Boynton versus Virginia, and I think it was the late 50s that this happened. And Boynton was a student. He was in college in the North, and he was traveling back down south for the holidays. And when his bus stopped at a rest station, he tried to buy a hamburger in a whites-only place and was arrested. And he brought his case before the Supreme Court and ultimately won and said that he should not have been arrested because segregation practices should be outlawed. So that was a landmark decision, but then it took so long for that to actually be enforced. Even though the Supreme Court made that decision and now was federal law, a lot of southern states refused to see that and still had segregation going on. So John and his friends at the SNCC worked really hard to desegregate lunch counters, movie theaters, other fast food restaurants, lots of places. And they did this through nonviolent sit-ins. So basically, if a lunch counter was segregated, they would go in, sit down at a seat, and ask to be served. And they would be turned away and told that they weren't welcome there. And they would sit and wait. And they would nonviolently resist what was going on because they thought that it was their right to sit down at a lunch counter and order a meal if they were hungry. And the Supreme Court had agreed with them, but they weren't getting the support from the local governments and from the state governments. A lot of time, there's a lot of violence in this. And it's true. John was beaten many times, along with his other people who were nonviolently resisting, were beaten by police officers, thrown in jail. Women were beaten. Men were beaten. In one case, I think about 1,000 children were arrested. They were not beaten, but they were arrested for having a march in their neighborhood. Police would say it was unlawful for them to congregate, so they would be arrested. And all this publicity of black people and white people trying to desegregate and doing it nonviolently, but then being beaten by police really caught the nation's attention. So the civil rights movement was started. People in the North and people all over could see firsthand what was going on, the violence that happened, the divisiveness between different people, and it really kind of forced people to sort of take sides and try and come up with a solution that we all could live with, and we all could get together in what was hopefully best for everybody. So they started a freedom ride. John was one. He went to Washington, D.C. in early 1961 for the first time and was greatly impressed with our nation's capital. And he was part of a group from SNCC that were called Freedom Riders. So basically, the segregation was outlawed by the Supreme Court, so they were going on a freedom ride to basically test this out. And stop along the way and challenge places where segregation was happening, and see if they could get more change to happen. They wanted the South to become unsegregated because they didn't feel that separate but equal really made much sense. A lot of the time, the separate facilities were not equal, and they didn't want that to be the case. It would be such a strange world if we still lived in a place where you couldn't go into a certain place because of the color of your skin. Or if you were hungry and you wanted to stop at a restaurant, you might not be allowed in, you might not be served just because you were black. So lots of people disagreed with this and wanted it changed, but it took lots of time. And so John worked at this along with his friends at the SNCC and Martin Luther King Jr. and many other prominent civil rights activists for years and years. And it got to where they were talking with President Kennedy, and they were starting to make little progress. So like they desegregated a movie theater in Nashville, Tennessee. It took them 14 weeks to accomplish that. It's just amazing stuff. But they were determined, and they kept at it. They held to their principles of nonviolence and knew that their cause was just, and that if they they kept to their principles, and other people were seeing what was going on, all the violence, the beatings, police using fire hoses on people, police using attack dogs on people, police arresting hundreds of children because they're marching together. They knew that if the world saw these things, that change would happen, and they were right. So things kept getting worse and worse, but eventually they did get better. In June of 1963, John was eventually elected as the chairman of the SNCC, and he's still in his early 20s, but his whole life is devoted to the civil rights cause and trying to integrate all of the country. Fannie Lou Hamer is a woman who is pretty well respected in her civil rights community. She attempted to register to vote, which was her right, and when her work found out that she had attempted to register to vote, she was fired from her job and she was arrested just for trying to register to vote, which was her right. And so when this happened to her, when she was fired and she was arrested, she joined the SNCC, and many people think she was the soul of the Mississippi movement. And there are lots of people, lots of activists throughout the trilogy that get a spotlight. And so we learn about all these people who were so important to the movement. People that I had heard of, but that I didn't know as much as the books explained. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. He was sympathetic and could work with a lot of the movement to desegregation, but so his assassination was kind of a setback. Lyndon Johnson was the vice president and succeeded, it replaced President Kennedy after he was killed. And Johnson was kind of on the fence. They didn't know which way he was going to go. But eventually Johnson would sign some pretty major pieces of legislation into law that helped the civil rights movement. But there was so much violence. But along the way, they'd have small victories that would keep them going. And really, their togetherness, like their teamwork, their job as a movement kept them going. They would support each other. They would get support from outside sources. And like I said, they knew that they thought that their cause was just, and they wanted to see a difference in the world. Summer of 1964, the SNC put most of their focus on trying to register as many people to vote as they could. You were allowed to register to vote in the 1870s if you were a black man, but it was very, very difficult. You would go to the courthouse, and sometimes you would wait all day in a line, and the line wouldn't move because the people working in the courthouse didn't want to see black people register to vote, because they thought that they would vote for politicians who were against segregation. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the South wanted segregation to continue. And one of the things that I had always heard about, but is represented in this trilogy in a really poignant, important way, is in January of 1963, George Wallace was elected the governor of Georgia. And in his infamous speech, he said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so when the governor of a whole state wants this practice of segregation to not only last and be the law of the land, but he thinks it should be forever, you can see how difficult and how divided people would be over that issue. So they did all they could to try and register people to vote, because there was going to be a presidential election in the fall of '64. And so they wanted their voice heard. They wanted their right to cast their ballot and vote in our democracy. But it was really tough. It was really tough going. Thankfully, on July 2nd, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. And as I said, President Lyndon Johnson was behind that. And that, in essence, ended discrimination and segregation in schools, libraries, and parks, and in hiring practices. But it did nothing to ban other voter restrictions. So this did a lot for black people, but it didn't address voter registration laws, which were still in place to make it so it was really difficult for black people to register to vote. So in Mississippi that summer in 1964, there were over 1,000 arrests, 80 beatings, 35 shootings, 35 church burnings, and over 30 bombings in one state. And it's just amazing. It really, all these things really woke people up to the violence that was happening within our own country. a lot of people didn't know that it was happening, and because when it received national attention and was put on the news, it really woke everyone up. Um, and then there was Bloody Sunday in 1965. John was a part of this in a historic march from Selma to Birmingham. Um, and they got to a bridge. The Alabama the Alabama, either the state troopers or the Alabama police were there and said you can't go any farther, even though they were just marching. And there was a huge bloody fight that happened. John almost was killed there. And then about a month later, August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, and finally got on law some meaningful laws to do away with discrimination and make it easier for black people to vote. There was still a lot to have happen. And there's so much in these books that, like I said, I knew a little bit about, but that really is gone over in a terrific way. So John Lewis, dedicated his whole life to making things better and more fair for all people. And he was eventually elected to Congress in Georgia, where while he was in Congress, he saw the first black president, Barack Obama, elected in the United States, which is a pretty cool thing. So throughout his life, he faced so many challenges. Was beaten, was put in jail lots of times. Had some difficulty with his parents. Lost friends, gained friends. So much happened, and so much hardship, but he did see so much progress throughout his life. And he did it by getting into good trouble and disobeying laws that he did not agree with. And so it's really, really inspiring, the work that they've done. John Lewis had help from Andrew Aden to write this trilogy, and Nate Powell was the illustrator. And just to end with here, I'd like to read a paragraph that John wrote that I think really exemplifies what he was about. It is for all people, but especially young people, to understand the essence of the civil rights movement, to walk through the pages of history, to learn about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence, to be inspired, to stand up, to speak out, and to find a way to get in the way when they see something that is not right, not fair, and not just. So there you go. Something I highly recommend. Won so many awards. It's really well done. The illustrations are great. The history is terrific. Like I said, you learn about a lot of civil rights heroes throughout the book. Really, really terrific stuff. All in graphic novel, young adult form. So, Mr. Jesse's giving his personal recommendation for the March trilogy. I don't have the first book because it's checked out. Somebody else is learning about it. So, hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'm not sure. I've got 2 that I'm going in between, so you'll have to tune in to check out and see what I choose.